One can only imagine how many times we have heard this parable of the prodigal son, which is so rich with joy and forgiveness, even in the midst of the distress and jealousy. It sits here in Luke at the end of 3 parables about finding something that was lost. First, the prodigal son, which we read, but before that, the lost sheep and the lost coin. All reasons to celebrate. The introduction to all these 3 parables we find in the first 3 verses that we read. The tax collectors and the sinners come to listen to Jesus. The scribes and the Pharisees off to the side grumbling about the company that Jesus keeps. And please don't miss the irony in here, and that subtle irony of the Pharisees' reference to sinners as those other people, but not themselves. The brilliance and the depth of this parable is that it speaks to us no matter who we are or where we are on our spiritual journey. The lessons taught here in this parable reach out to us on so many levels. And depending on your own situation in life and in faith, you could write yourself into any one of these characters. This is possible for us because there is a theme which underlies every possible interpretation of this parable, and that theme is the theme of reconciliation. Our innate need for reconciliation goes hand in hand with our deepest desire to know God, and it is at the heart of our relationship with God. So, before we get further into this, let us pause and go back to the text and try to understand what is perhaps not yet understood by us because we have some cultural differences here. We must understand that in asking for his inheritance early, the prodigal son here is going way beyond simply insulting his father. He is basically saying to his father, "You are better dead to me than alive." All the value of his father lies only in the inheritance that comes with his death. And by walking away to a foreign land, this young man is not simply turning his back on his family, he's turning his back on his nation, and indeed, subtly here, is turning his back on his faith. And then we find that things get so bad for him, he's reduced to serving a pig. And remember, a pig is an animal to the Jewish listeners that was considered untouchable and unclean. This young man, when he gets to his bottom, feeding the pigs, can't get any lower. He cannot fall any further from grace. And yet, in the midst of the depths of his personal crisis, he is convicted of his sins, i.e., he came to himself. That is to say, he looked into that proverbial mirror and saw himself finally for what he really was. And understands that his only hope is to turn home in hope of finding work. This act of contrition is beyond saying, "I'm sorry." Because he doesn't expect to go home and be treated like a son. No, he expects to go home and is hoping that he might be treated like a slave. And yet we see what happens here is truly amazing. The father sees him coming because even though the father should feel that his son is dead, he does not. The father has been living in the hope that every day his son will return. And so the reconciliation that the prodigal hopes for is one that simply that he might be able to live, but rather what he receives in this greeting is more than reconciliation, it is restoration. He becomes alive again. And he's able to become this man's son again. Now, of course, the elder son is not amused. He sees no reason to celebrate. It's difficult for him to understand how this younger brother could be welcomed back home when he, the elder son, has stood by his father all these years and has never left. And in this, the elder son has every right to be upset, doesn't he? Doesn't he? Yeah, you know it's a trick question. Okay. Because if you are listening to the first text we read, that whole idea that we are to no longer regard anyone from a human point of view, then you know where this is leading. Because the older brother does regard him from that human point of view. And in our humanity, of course, we look at this and we say, the older son is right. He should be angry. Because most of us would be angry, even if we're not willing to admit it. There is a great deal of pain and emotional hardship in this story, more than enough to go around. The fractured relationships represented in the story cry out for reconciliation, a reconciliation that in our human point of view probably could never happen. And in hearing this story, though, friends, we who listen to it are called once again to Paul's words, to enter into a ministry of reconciliation. And that's going to be hard. Now, the most common way of looking at this story is to understand that the Father is God. It's very comforting for us to know that no matter what we do, no matter how far down into the dregs of our humanity that we sink, that God will always be there watching for us to return, always ready to welcome us back, and we should thank God every day, for that is the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That we who are so unworthy, that we who have drifted so far away from God, can always return and know that God will welcome us and restore us to where he intends. Never lose sight of that, friends, in the midst of this text. And most people never do, because that's the part we love the most. As the prodigal, if you write yourself into that story, we must come to the understanding that we, friends, are the ones who turn away from God, and God does not turn from us. We are the ones who do not deserve to be loved nor forgiven by God, and yet God is willing. We are the ones who fracture our relationship with God and with our brothers and sisters by our actions, and more deeply by our willful rejection of what we know to be right. The younger son is full of pride and self-reliance. His youthful arrogance and this belief that he needs no one gets him into trouble. And how many times in and around our lives have we seen that played out? The reconciliation here between father and son is a model of reconciliation between God and ourselves. But it should also be the model for reconciliation between ourselves and other people. We find comfort in seeing ourselves as the prodigal. And we really want to see ourselves as the forgiving Father. But the real challenge is to be willing to understand how much we resemble the older brother. Because that's not who we want to be, even if it is more of who we are. We read this text and we ask again, is it fair that the one who remained faithful all these years should be overlooked for the one who rebelled and has now returned? And of course, in our human way of thinking, no, it isn't fair. But again, if you remember the words of Isaiah last week, my ways are not your ways. If you hear the words of Paul today, think no more of people in human terms, then yes, God's idea of fair and just doesn't always seem fair and just to us. The older brother is filled with jealousy and envy and frustration, perhaps a little too much self-importance, and certainly with a lot of self-righteous indignation. Reconciliation between these two brothers is going to be difficult, because God's forgiveness can sometimes be difficult for us to take when it's extended to those whom we don't like, or who are, at the very least, less deserving than us. It seems a little unfair that so much attention is given to the people who are new or perhaps have returned to the faith after falling away for so long into so many places. But friends, those of us who have been in church for any period of time always run the risk of becoming like the older brother. And I'll admit to you, I was there too. I've never known anything but the church. I was raised in the church. I've never known anything but the love of God in my life. And yet, I still couldn't understand why we make such a big deal out of these people who were sinners and came back to Jesus. And so we all want to hear them preach, and we all want to hear them speak because of this great thing that's happened to them. Well, what about the rest of us who didn't fall away? What do we get? And yes, I spent a good deal of my youth feeling that same frustration. But as I grew older, I began to realize something else. As I grew older and experienced more of life, as I grew older and met those prodigals who were living in the ditch, as I met and heard the stories of those people who came out of that ditch and returned to the church, returned to God, I began to realize more and more that we should not ignore the suffering of the prodigal here. We should not only rejoice at regaining what was lost, but friends, likewise, we should rejoice in the fact that we have not had to suffer the humiliation that they did. As I grew older in my life and in my faith, I began to realize I should be thankful at every story of reconciliation with God because I didn't have to go there. I was fortunate. I was blessed that I was raised in the church and raised around people who loved me and cared for me and expressed to me what it means to be loved by God. I was blessed that I didn't have to live through that hell in order to get to where I am today. And so here again is the call and the challenge of reconciliation for us. Paul's minister of reconciliation is the call first to be reconciled to God ourselves, and then to seek reconciliation for and with the rest of the world. But friends, how often do we stand in the way of that reconciliation with our self-righteous indignation toward those who aren't Christians like us? How often do we look down our nose because they don't do it the way we do it? Because they don't dress the way we dress. They don't speak with the same language that we speak. Because they're less than us. How many people do we push away from the reconciliation with God because of the way we treat those struggling to grow in Christ? Friends, we know that we must be inviting and loving and welcoming and forgiving. But we must also be patient toward those who are seeking to return to God. And even in those moments when we think we are welcoming and loving and inviting and patient, we're not really, are we? We must be aware that those people who are struggling to return and those people who are out wandering in the darkness still are watching us, watching how we treat them and others, watching how we speak to them and about others who are still wandering out in the dark. And I say this now with the same shame and guilt with which I have had to hear it. Our failure as self-described Christians to act like Christ-like Christians has done and continues to damage the church, and it hurts God's children far beyond our reckoning. It would take all day to describe the ways we fail to act Christ-like, even here within the church. But let us start by simply recognizing how we treat others less than ourselves in any way. Paul writes that we are ambassadors for Christ, which means we are to walk through this world representing Jesus Christ to those who do and do not yet know Jesus Christ. And if that is the case, friends, then what are we doing? It is no wonder that the largest growing religious group, or shall I say non-religious group in this country, are the nones, those who have no affiliation with a church. Why would they want to? Our Pharisaical hypocrisy in the way we act and treat each other, even within the church, is crushing the church. And it is building an impenetrable wall that keeps far too many people out. And that says nothing about the way we drive people to throw themselves over that wall, because they want nothing more to do with our Pharisaical hypocrisy of loving one another. In this time of Lenten self-examination, we are called to take long, hard, honest looks in the mirror at ourselves. And in doing so, we have to fight the spiritual dysmorphia that tells us that we're okay and it's only those other people who have problems. Because it ain't just them. I took a hard look in that proverbial mirror as I wrote this sermon. And friends, I did not see as much of Christ looking back to me as I had hoped. And so I know I have much work to do. I thank God and I praise Jesus that I have been reconciled to God. But there is much more work ahead in reconciling myself to others. Much more work ahead in reconciling how I have been the Pharisaical hypocrite who has pushed others away. How I have built walls that have kept those out who are less than me. And so I now challenge you. In fact, I dare you to do the same. Look into the mirror with that hard, long, truly honest look at yourself. And then perhaps we can truly begin to welcome those who are still out there wandering in the dark. Perhaps then together we can begin to tear down the walls that we have built to keep them out. And in this way, we will show them that we have truly been reconciled to God by the way we act and the way we speak and the way we love one another as Christ loves us. Not as the world loves one another, but as Christ has loved us. Amen.